Welcome everybody. In this video we're going to be talking about authentication schemas. A lot of beginners are confused about this topic. I certainly was when I was starting. I didn't quite understand. We have the cookie schema and we may potentially have a couple of schemas somewhere else. What does it actually mean? What are we trying to represent? What idea is the authentication schema pointing at? When we were taking a look at the authentication in the very first video, we've understood that with authentication there is a way that you can log in, and that is basically dealing out a cookie, and then you are able to get that cookie and open it up and get out the values, therefore achieving your authentication session. Those 2 points live on the authentication handler that you register here, and we will take a look at it in a second, but understand that the process of dealing out the cookie and then being able to recognize the cookie is a single authentication type. This is the same as going to the government, getting a passport, and then being able to use the passport to go into places and people being able to recognize. This is the passport authentication schema. Hopefully then the analogy goes as follows. You have the driving license, you may have some kind of legal document, etc. You may understand at this point, okay, I get the analogy. How does it map to the programming world? When am I ever going to need multiple schemas? So here is an example. You are building a shop, okay? And you have customers and you have various types of customers. You have a visitor, person that's just visiting, and you want to be able to map a cart to him. You may have a user that is then logged into your shop. He can track his orders or get special discounts. And then perhaps you're a YouTube creator where you have a Patreon page and there are people who have been supporting you for years. You've released a shop and you want to give them a bigger discount. But for this, you need to verify that that user has been actually supporting you on their Patreon. So before they can get any discount, they actually have to log in and then they have to connect their Patreon account. What I've described here is 3 authentication schemas, and this is what we're going to take a look at here. This is primarily going to be cookie authentication and auth. If you are just starting out the playlist, please hold on tight. If you don't understand auth, we will cover it later a little bit more in depth. So let's go to the example. Here we have an endpoint. Again, this can be fetch product, fetch discount. Any kind of logic can sit here. You then have the login local endpoint, and this is when you actually input your credentials and you get back a cookie. This is the middle scenario. This is where I'm just a user, I'm logged in. Well, what if before you logged in, you were going to be a visitor? This is going to be a different authentication schema. Let's add another cookie authentication schema, and we're going to call it visitor. And before we move on to the auth schema, we're going to see how these two compete with each other. Now, adding cookie this way will require me to implement something in the middle that basically says, look, as soon as you visit my website, I just give you back a cookie. So you may do some kind of redirect stuff and all of that. What I'm going to opt in for is I'm going to go to add cookie. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the default authentication handler that it registers here, the cookie authentication handler. I'm going to take it. I'm going to come back to program CS, jump to the bottom, and I'll create a public class. And let me put a bunch of spaces here so we can look at it. And visitor auth handler, I can spell today, and I'll just extend the current cookie authentication. I then know that I will need a constructor because my IDE tells me, but I can override some members, and specifically what I'm looking for is handle authenticate async. As we've seen in the previous episode, this is the handler that gets called when we're going through the authentication pipeline. So I will select this and I will say okay. I'll try to do the default cookie authentication, so I'm trying to read a cookie, and this is going to give me some kind of result. All right. If the result is successful, let's see if there is some kind of success. This is asynchronous, so we will need to await on this, make this asynchronous. If the result succeeded, cool. Let's just go ahead and pass on the result. And I can't spell today. Now, if we haven't succeeded, how about we force a sign-in, right? So just sign you in, and that's it. In the many parameters that get passed in the constructor, what you don't actually see is one of the services, or rather important services, that gets attached to the cookie authentication handler. If we open it up, we go into a little bit down the tree, but down here you will find the HTTP context. So we can actually use this to call sign-in async. All right, so I will close all of this. If I'm successful, just carry on. If it's not successful, let's sign in async, and we'll sign in as visitor. All I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab this authentication that I'm doing here. The identity that I'm creating over here is going to be a visitor identity, and let me just make sure that I've messed up my setup example, but never mind. This is going to be local, this is going to be visitor, and this is the user that's going to be signed in. Semicolon and await, and finally I'm going to force an authentication result to be successful with a new authentication ticket, where I will need to pass a claims principal. So I'll just pass this user. So not only am I dealing out a set cookie, the user that I just created, I'm just saying for this current request that is happening, use this user. In addition to the user, again, we just have to re-specify the authentication schema that we have actually signed in with. If you're wondering why do you have to specify the authentication schema so many times, we've said it here. Why do we say it here and here? There are going to be situations, like in the case of auth, where again, we're saying that authentication schema is responsible for grouping together the creation and recognition of the thing that you've authenticated with. So the situation is that you are going to use a single authentication schema for creation, and then you're going to do some magic to put it back into another authentication schema, so then you can just recognize it. And that's what happens in the case of auth, where we're saying do this whole redirect malarkey for the creation and then deal out the cookie. So we take one creation process, chain it into the next one, so then we can just recognize it. But anyway, we will get to that step in a couple of minutes. Here's our visitor authentication cookie. Let's see it work. I will come back here. I will open up the developer tools. If I refresh this now, if we've noticed in the previous examples, we just get authenticated regardless. However, here right now, I am not seeing a cookie. It's not being appended. The reason for that is because we're not specifying a default authentication schema, and we're not requiring anything on the endpoint, right? So there is no way for our application to determine, should you be signing in with this? Do you even need it? There doesn't seem to be a default. I don't think I can even attempt to start guessing what should I try to recognize. Why should your application start looking at cookies if you don't specify a default authentication schema? And the thing that we have here, we have a visitor and a local authentication schema. So it can either be a visitor or a user. They should both be able to access products or discounts, etc. Okay, this is where your policy comes in, and this is a way that you can specify what authentication schemas you want. So again, we'll bring in our, let's say, authorization builder. On the builder, we're going to add policy, and we're going to say that it's a customer that is going to be looking at these. We're then going to have a policy builder, add authentication schemas, there we go, local, visitor, and then we're going to require authentication. So require authenticated user. And now that we have the customer policy, let's set it on this endpoint, require authorization for policy of customer. Let's wait for our application to refresh, come back around and refresh. And we're seeing a 404 because we're being redirected to login. So we haven't authenticated. Let's come back around and, okay, so I'm not actually using the visitor auth handler. Let's go ahead and grab it. I'll rename the constructor and I'll drop down the terminal. We want to do the same thing that add cookie does down here, add schema, and then our custom schema. Let's come back around to here. We'll add a new authentication schema, a new way to create something, and a new way to actually read it. I'll just use the same cookie authentication options, but then supply my visitor cookie authentication handler. This will require me to put some default options here, so I'm just going to supply an empty lambda. And there we go, so this should now produce a cookie for me. I'm loading 2 authentication schemas. However, this should only bring up the single one. I should be authenticated with one, but not the other. Let's take a look at the result. We'll come back here and we're gonna navigate. If we come back around to the application and we're gonna go to login local, so /login local, we're now gonna have 2 cookies. And both of those should be loaded here. So now we can be recognized as a customer either if we have a visitor cookie or if we have local authentication, and we can check for this logic inside the controller or a handler. Let's go ahead and attach a debugger so we see what it looks like. I'm going to attach to add authentication schemas. Looks like that is going. I will refresh. And looks, so let's actually hit home. And this should give us the debugger. In the context, what I want to find is the user object. Okay, so if you are doing MVC, the user object should be on the controller. Let's open up the user. In here, we're going to see that we have the 2 identities. The first identity is the visitor, and then, whoa, I'm not sure what that was. The second identity is local. So now I can, look at the identity. Who is it? Factory pattern, get one handler for a visitor or get the other handler for a local user, right? Now, let's kick it up a notch. Let's go to the example where we may have some kind of user who's been a patron supporter for a long time and, is given a lot of money, didn't get anything back in return. Perhaps you want a third handler for users that are patrons, see some kind of products that are not there, whatever. Your creativity is the limit here. So in addition to our cookie of adding local, we're gonna add auth. Auth is gonna be external auth, or let's say external patron. Okay, this is gonna have some options, and what I'm using for this example, again, for people that know auth, this is gonna be okay-ish. For people that don't know auth, this might be a little bit confusing, but here's some information. We just need to put it in. This is a mock API. All this is gonna do is just gonna go through the flow, and it's gonna help me authenticate. So I'm gonna input some of these options here. Usually you'd get things like some kind of client ID, you'd get a client secret, but because this is a mock API, you don't get it. And if you're wondering about ID and secret, this is just like a username and password for your application. Okay, so you have these things, and then you have to specify some configuration. This is where you go to obtain certain tokens and stuff like that. So we're gonna have the authorization endpoint. Let's just whack this information in there. Same for the token endpoint. Let's put that there. User info URL, and the last one we can skip. One thing is that I'm also going to define is my callback path. This is just going to be CB patron, so callback patron. I have a video available on auth. I'm actually going to link it in this description if you want to understand a little bit more about auth and what I'm doing here. Finally, I am going to add some scopes, for example, like profile. Not that it's going to help me that much. And I'm also going to save tokens. I'm going to set to true. And now for the final bit, the bit why you're still here. When we go and get the token, you usually don't put tokens in the browser because it's a little bit sensitive information and you gotta handle it manually, and there is room for user error there. If it's a cookie, browsers handle it securely automatically. So what we want to do is save the token into a cookie, and this specific service actually already implements this. And what you're saying here is, sign in schema. So when you're creating, right, when you want to create as some kind of other schema. I can supply visitor here. I can supply local here. If I put in local, it is just going to flat out override my local authentication session, right? So if I have some kind of additional parameters for my users, it's just going to erase those. You have to do a little bit more work to combine them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to have another cookie, and you can be authenticated locally. And if you have extended your current authentication session with actually being authenticated with patron, you're going to have an additional cookie. Okay, so this is going to be a patron cookie. And when we have the sign-in schema here, we specify patron cookie. So when we actually finish obtaining tokens, we will deal out a patron cookie. And in order to reach a login for patron, you will actually have to be a user. So let's add a policy. Will be a user, and you have to be logged in with local, no visitors. Let's attach the user here. And then instead of signing in, we don't want to forge the identity. It comes externally. We just want to say, go over there. For this, there is a challenge, async, okay? We've talked about creating cookies and then reading cookies. And cookie is just a collection of strings. It could be really creating anything, reading anything. Challenge async is, listen, we don't know who you are. Go and create your thing. And that is what challenge is. Challenge is a way to basically say, go to the creation process. And usually in your options over here, this is where you would specify where do you go for the creation options. Do you go to the login screen? Do you get redirected somewhere? So in here specifically, when we get challenged, when we need to go to the creation process, we will get redirected and we will pop on a different login screen where we will need to input our credentials, etc. And that's about it. But here I'm going to use the external patron, place it over here, semicolon, and then await. And I think actually this can just be a lambda. And look at that. All right. So I think this has reloaded. No longer need this website. Let's come back over here. Let's make sure that I still have only 2 cookies. Cool. And actually, let's do this. We will log in, patron, and we're going to get redirected 404 to a login. So essentially, if we fail authentication, we get challenged. So we get redirected to the login screen. So first of all, what we want to do is we want to log in with local. There we have it. And then we want to log in with patron because we have an authentication session that we want to tie our patron account with. And you can have multiples. You can have a GitHub account, you can have a Facebook account, you can tie all of these things into your service, right? We'll do something like bob@test.com and then log in. This is going to actually be pretty funny. So let's try this again. Password, log in, and you will see that I'm logging in, it's redirecting me to the callback patron, and then I'm getting redirected to login patron again, and I'm kind of stuck in this loop. So what I want to say is when I log into patron, let me drop this down to a new line over here. In the authentication properties that I'm passing here, I want to specify a redirect URI where I'm going to return to just the root path, okay? And if you're wondering how or where these authentication properties end up in, again, I highly recommend you download Rider or some kind of decompiler. You can open up add auth, you can go to the auth handler, you can look at auth properties, or actually let's just straight up look for challenge, where we'll find a function that looks something like this. You will see how it basically tries to use the redirect URI. It takes your slash, it reconstructs the whole thing based on your current path, etc. Let's back out from here. Now that I'm actually telling go generate your token, once you're done with everything and you come back, this is where you come back. So let's come back over here. And actually I want to restart. Let's open up another window. We're again going to open up the network tab in the application. I know I have a patron cookie somewhere over here, but we are just gonna shred it. We're then gonna log in with patron, get redirected, log in, and there we have it. We're back here. The cookie window is a little bit slow to refresh, but there we have it. We have patron cookie. Let's reattach the debugger and take a look at this authentication schema. Looks like that is good. Refresh. And again, context. Scroll down to the user, open it up, and we have 2 identities. I have specified customer over here, so we're only loading visitor and local. Let's go ahead also load the patron user here because we value our patron users, right? Let's grab local, we'll put it over here, and we want the patron cookie. So once you actually have the patron cookie, this is what we are going to be checking. We cannot check this external patron authentication schema purely for redirecting you, purely for the challenge. This is why we have this authentication schema, to say, go and obtain, but then during the obtaining process, create for this patron cookie. And this is what we specify here. We're specifying this other authentication schema. So we've specified that there. Let's reattach. Let's refresh the page. And there we have it. Let's take a look at the context. User, identities, now we have 3. The third one is external patron. We don't have many claims. The that mock API doesn't really return any claims, but hopefully you get the picture. In this video, we've taken a look at 3, even 4 authentication schemas. The first one is the visitor authentication schema, which is kind of just locally. You land on the website and you're a user. We now know how to identify you. We've just given you a token, no questions asked. Now, if you authenticate with us, you're a user, we need to be able to slice between the visitors and the users. This is a different authentication schema. And finally, even further, let's say you want to go ahead and extend your current login session with more privileges. So you log in with Patron, some kind of other service, so you're enabling more functionality in this application. So you go and obtain a token, and we just deal you out another cookie to basically say you have more privileges, but before you actually do this, you need to be a user. This authentication schema stuff can go as far as locally, we are going to have a cookie authentication schema. You can go sign in with Google, you can go sign in with Facebook, but once you come here, we process the tokens and then we create our own cookie token from there. So you would have 3 authentication schemas, one for obtaining tokens from Google or one for obtaining tokens from Facebook, and then the local one, which is your cookie authentication schema, which is local. And that is the end of the story. This will be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions or want to say thank you, leave it in the comment section, or better yet, come support me on Patreon. Very big thank you to all my current Patreon supporters. You help me make these videos. And a little announcement, I will be at NDC Oslo. If you're going to be there as well, come say hi, message me on Discord if you're going to be there. I might have a present, I might not. Anyway, again, thank you for watching and have a good day.